everyone. Welcome to another episode of Reinforcement with Vic Williams. And today I have a very special friend of mine. I've worked with her for years. Matter of fact, the first presentation I've ever done on human trafficking was to her organization called Club Operators Against Sex Trafficking. C.O.A.S.T is the acronym. And I'd like to welcome my good friend, Angelina Spencer Crisp. Hey, Angelina.
Hey, Victor. It is wonderful to be here, and I'm so excited that you're doing this.
Nah, thank you. And I'm glad we're back together again. I know COVID shut things down for a while, and we've done a couple events last month, and it was such a pleasure to be in that space. But before we go there, let's talk about C.O.A.S.T. Where did C.O.A.S.T come from, and how did you get here?
So years ago, I'm talking 2008, 2009, we began to see a lot of legislation aimed at the strip club industry with regard to human trafficking. And we had to ask ourselves some questions. And really what kicked it off was a raid on a club in Portland, Maine, where Homeland Security investigations received a tip that potentially a minor was working in a club in Maine, and they raided the establishment because, as you know, and you've been in the trenches, Victor, when it comes to a minor, all bets are off, and you want to rescue that victim. Well, it turns out that it was not a minor victim. It was a disgruntled boyfriend who had called in a false tip because he was upset with his girlfriend working at the club. But it sort of forced us to look at what is, human trafficking. And we didn't really have that answer back then. We didn't really know much about what this crime entailed. So we had a learning curve. And as we looked at some of the legislation, we realized this is really not empowering. The legislation really punished women. So, for example, you get 6-foot rules where a woman was charged with a first-degree misdemeanor in some states like Ohio if she walked within 6 feet of a man in a club, but the gentleman wasn't punished. So we said, how does this save a victim or rescue a victim or help a victim? So we had to look at that. And eventually we ended up talking with, first we had gone to the FBI with the program. And then we ended up talking to HSI. And at the time it was the Honorable Alice Hill. And we went to DHS headquarters in DC. And we laid out the baby steps of C.O.A.S.T. Because we needed help, and we felt that if we were truly going to educate this industry on human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, we really wanted the credibility of certified law enforcement to do that training. Right. I could do training. Other people could step in and do training. But I think there's more credibility when it comes from federal agents such as you were yourself to offer that training, because you know the indicators, you've been in the trenches, you've rescued victims, and it just lends more credibility. So we were able to, through the Honorable Alice Hill, she gave us her tentative blessing, if you will, and granted the agents and allowed them to do the trainings. And we don't do any trainings inside clubs. So that's one rule that was sort of, it's never
changed.
Been sanctioned. But we really try to find a neutral location if we can. I know that we've had maybe 2 or 3 instances where we have had it in the club because it was sort of a sudden thing, if you will.
Right.
And yeah.
But before you go on, if you guys, I did a very bad job in the introduction, like what is C.O.A.S.T? So it's just like one of these things that I'm still learning how to do these podcasts, because I want them to be very informative and people learn from it. And there's always a takeaway. If you haven't caught on yet, C.O.A.S.T Club Operators Against Sex Trafficking is the strip club industry. The people who work in a legal industry want to do things right. So C.O.A.S.T was started to educate and bring on partners from that industry to educate them to protect a legal industry, but also protect the women that work in those industry. And before we go further, Angelina, tell me about you. How did you get into this process? Because I know you have a story.
I do. Boy, do I have a story. So I was raised at the ward of the court. I was a foster child. And when I aged out of foster care, you turn 18 and they can't help you anymore. So at the time, and it's my understanding this has changed considerably, thankfully, you really didn't receive any life skills training. So I was cut loose from the foster care system and left to wander out in the world with no adult supervision. I was considered an adult at the age of 18, but no adult supervision, no guidance. And I went to work and I call it as a victim of minimum wage, because you certainly can't survive. I had a baby to support, and someone introduced me. It was actually someone from my hometown that I had gone to high school with, and we're still friends. And she introduced me to the adult entertainment industry. So I became a dancer, and I danced for many years. And then I ended up co-owning a club, which I co-owned a club, and I've worked in every facet of the industry. But I did use the industry and my work there as a stepping stone rather than a tombstone. So, I was able to get it. I graduated summa cum laude from Ursuline College. I started at Cuyahoga Community College and earned an associate's, went on and got a bachelor's, and then graduated as the co-valedictorian of the George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management, and also studied writing at the London School of Journalism and at Oxford at the University of Oxford. Excuse me, let me slow down. University of Oxford at Exeter College.
Right.
So, yeah.
And I remember, I want to say, I don't remember the year. Like I said, I remember the first time we met was we were doing a human trafficking presentation for some clubs in the Miami, South Florida area, and we were at the Hard Rock Hotel. And it was my first presentation on human trafficking. I don't even think I could remember what the word, you got force, fraud, and coercion. I had to ask one of the agents that had been a little bit more experienced, what's coercion again? It was really interesting. And it was a lot of pressure. And I know over the years, as we worked together and the more I learned, every year I would come back and ask these guys and they would say, hey, Victor, you're getting better at this, So, but recently we, COVID shut things down. I think I retired. I don't know if I know you are all over. The coast is just not a local Florida thing. You're nationwide. And I don't know what happened when I retired. I know I went off to Georgia, but I've always kept you in mind. And then COVID hit. That really shut things down. I came back to South Florida August of 2021 and got Quest of Freedom going. And just recently we did a coast in West Palm Beach and in Fort Lauderdale. Let's talk about those a little bit. That's the reunite of what you guys are doing and where we are. And I think those presentations were the best. And even you said, we're all getting better at this. And let's talk about those two presentations recently.
I would agree with you, but I have to give you credit because you by far were not the worst agent that ever spoke. And I remember Houston, we had 610 people in the room. And this poor agent was on the human trafficking task force or part of that. She had just joined that team probably 10 minutes prior to them standing in front of 610 people.
Wow.
And Yeah, so it was in the poor, and luckily we had an NGO there that kind of came in. Now, fast forward, Victor, and we'll talk about Palm Beach and the Fort Lauderdale area, the Broward County area. I do feel that was one of well, actually, both of those were two of the best presentations. And I'll tell you, your speech in Fort Lauderdale was outstanding. And why? Because there's a sincerity there. There's a faith there. There is and we improve as we hopefully as we grow, right? And,
yes.
And we gain experience. But your sincerity, your genuineness, you captured the emotionality of the room. And one of the things that, first and foremost, saving a life is a valuable thing to do. And that's the one thing that we never forget when we're doing C.O.A.S.T. The second thing is we don't want minors in our clubs. So one of the things that we were trying to prevent, and one of the biggest factors that we saw and Florida actually implemented was mandatory age verification. So it's not just with adult clubs, it's any establishment that may be serving liquor. Sometimes if you have absentee owners or if you have people that aren't doing, or they're letting somebody in, they need it drilled into them that this is a business, and adult entertainment is called adult entertainment for a reason. It's not meant for children.
Right.
And so that's gone a long way. But with regard to that meeting in Palm Beach and Fort Lauderdale, I think the agents really working with LaTanya Whitsett at the program analyst at the Center for Countering Human Trafficking, and putting together a cohesive presentation and localizing it too, which I thought was important.
Yes.
And talking about those cases both inside and outside of this industry, and the indicators, and how you and I include you in this because I know that you're still involved with human trafficking task forces, and now you have Quest to Freedom. But I think it's very important, this cohesiveness. You humanize the federal agents, or law enforcement. We've had other law enforcement do trainings too that aren't federal agents, but you humanize. And when you have NGOs and you have services in the room and you have agents in the room, and then you have people from the adult entertainment community, and they are, like you said in your speech, they become like family, the people that work in the industry. And when you put faces together and you realize that there are some commonalities, and I jokingly referred it to the commonalities, I kind of made the stereotypical jokes about, they don't trust each other. They're sometimes there's a lot of distrust and et cetera, but then there's a lot of commonality.
Right.
We all want children protected. We don't want to see anyone come into the clubs that don't want to be there or being forced or coerced to be there. So there are points of agreement. And I think that was conveyed at these two particular meetings quite succinctly. And I credit you and I credit the agents that did those presentations for that.
Well, look, I recognize the importance of having them in the room, having us in the room, building those relationships, because like we say, it is a legal business. And at the same time, you're here because, again, it's about saving lives, right? And we all, that's the commonality. We don't want people where they don't want to be. And we want to make sure that whoever wants to be there, they're there because they want to be, not because they're out of force, fraud, or coercion. And I recognized that when I first started working with you, and why those partnerships and trust is so important. And I remember mentioning, and I didn't call out the club because I didn't want to put anybody on notice of anything. But I remember one of the connections that even when I was working that we made with the club and educating them was, whenever a girl comes into a club for a job and they ask for her ID and she goes, I have to get my ID from that other person, taking somebody's ID and having control of somebody's ID is probably one of the number one factors of control. And so they recognize that particular club would recognize, like, that's not good. And with some other things that may go in place, they would take that information, get whatever information they get on the individual, and pass that information off on to law enforcement. Whether you like strip clubs or not, it's a legal business, and we need to have relationships with them in order to, like you said, the commonality, fight human trafficking and save lives.
That's right. Well, I got to interject a little bit, Victor, too, because the one thing, and I've heard people say, well, all of these, they need to be closed. They need to be closed up so we don't have any more human trafficking. That's not how it works.
Right.
So Texas is a perfect example of that. For whatever reason in Texas during COVID, when all strip clubs were closed or they were at 25% capacity and they were not allowed to have entertainment, the rate of sex trafficking allegedly went up by 50%. And this is when this was during lockdown. So, and then they came back and they blamed the clubs for the increase, but yet they couldn't offer the evidence, the proof.
Right.
So when we aggregate federal data, which before I used the Uniform Crime Reporting Stats, and I know now we use NEBRS, but when I aggregated all the data I could find, whether it was academic, NGO, anecdotal, Polaris, or the FBI's crime reporting stats, it showed that sex trafficking in strip clubs is now less than 1%. Now, that said, I say the data's bunk. The government agrees with me the data's bunk. And in fact, 2 Florida legislators have said, have introduced legislation to study or to task the AG to do a study on prevalence in the strip club industry as it relates to sex trafficking. I'm curious to see the methodology on that. But again, going back outside of all that, those numbers and that data is the importance of saving a life. And people that work in this industry are still members of the community. And just because you might close a club down, and I'm not saying that trafficking never happens in a club, but when you close clubs down, you might be exacerbating the issue.
Yes.
And just because you think you're closing a club, it doesn't mean that suddenly human trafficking percentages have dropped by 90%. It means that your trafficking victims have probably gone underground, and that's a huge disservice.
Yes.
And yes, and the clubs can be a viable intel to trace maybe some of those patterns. And we have had positive outcomes, and we have had tips reported, as you know,
Yes.
That have led to the successful. And again, I go back to people don't want women being abused through those clubs, especially the clubs they work in. And we have rescued some women. So I kind of look at it that way too. If you close the doors, what happens?
Yes.
If you think that it's just that they're all purveyors of sex trafficking, then maybe you should keep the doors open.
No.
And yeah.
No, I totally agree with you, because you close the doors of this legal business, they go underground, and worse things happen. When you leave the business open, because it's legal, and you create the partnership with law enforcement gets to come in. They don't come in wearing the badges and the guns. They come in, whether it's just coming in to make sure, things are running, to make sure the partnership is running together. Clubs invite law enforcement in. Come on in. You guys have access anywhere you want to go to make sure everything is going great. But I loved one of the things that you said at one of the meetings, where people look at clubs as the gateway to human trafficking. And I remember saying that's not the case. The gateway to human trafficking starts at home. It starts at home with all of the, trauma, generational trauma passed along from adults to their kids. It's that trauma, that unresolved trauma that starts at home, that makes people vulnerable, that traffickers seek to exploit. So
right.
Clubs aren't where, the nucleus of trafficking is starting. You know, they can be, and it works better when there's a partner. And you also said, you know, the people in the room are the ones that's trying to do it right. You had mentioned something about fly by night, and I hadn't really heard of it until you mentioned it. These pop-up strip clubs. Can you talk about that? Because when the people in the room want to do things right, that's why they're in the room, to establish the relationship with law enforcement so that everybody is working together to save lives and protect women. But talk about these pop-up strip clubs, because I hadn't heard about it until you mentioned it.
Sure. So there are certain factions who, whether it's a criminal ring or a criminal enterprise, or it's a bunch of people who decide, hey, we're going to just do a pop-up strip club in a residential neighborhood or at a warehouse. I'm trying to think of all the places: warehouses, barns, residential properties, closed bars, and they don't go through the permitting. They don't go through the licensing. They could be illicit cantinas, but yet they get lumped with the legal strip club industry, and they just pop up. So they send out a social media, almost like a flash, and they say, hey, between these hours, we're going to have, 50 women here. And they're going to, come join it. And they keep it really quiet or underground, just like you've got familiarity as a federal agent with the apps that were used to troll children. They would use these apps and they send it out, and then a bunch of people, show up. And in some cases, hundreds of people show up, and these people make a couple $100,000. I know in one case during COVID, they had one pop up in mid-Florida, somewhere in central Florida, and they had I think they said when they shut down, they had over $250,000 for just a few hours, and it's all cash, and they all dissipate, they all go away. But where do the victims go?
Yeah.
So those are the things that are very difficult. And you and I have talked about this, how the in-house domestic victim, human trafficking victim, is probably one of the hardest cases to make and to discover because it's that hidden crime.
Right.
And we had an example in Naples, Florida, of a woman who, and it was her pastor who rescued her because she had been held in a home of two doctors. This is in a gated community of two doctors. She had been their domestic slave for 20 years. Wow. And a pastor came to the church. The only time she was allowed to go out was every Sunday she was allowed to go to church. And he struck up a friendship with her, started talking with her, and said something is wrong here, because she had told him that they forced her into a closet and they would feed her the scraps. And they made their case, and they had to pay restitution, and she was reunited with her family, which was overseas. They had brought her from overseas. And, and there's a lot of cases like that. And there's a lot of, I had a federal agent, Kevin Abar, say to me one time when there was a big rescue in Albuquerque, I said, how many people were saved? And he said, that's not my concern. I want to know how many we missed.
Yeah. That's a good point.
And yeah.
I know one of the things that you guys do is not just educate, but you follow law. You try to push for legislation. You advocate for this business. Any new laws coming up? Because I remember when we did the Palm Beach coast, and one thing I always liked about Palm Beach is that everybody thinks that the state or the state government has to make laws to make things happen. You got local ordinance that can make things happen. And the one thing that I liked about West Palm Beach, which I think should be applied to as a nation law, is that any woman or anybody working in the strip club industry must register with the city. And what that does, it helps give you another layer to make sure children aren't showing up in this processes. I know there was one case where you mentioned one did slip through going through that process. But when you don't have that process, you have more chances. And, if, everybody's like waving the flag. We got to protect our children. I wish this was a state law, not only a state law. I wish it was a national law. Anybody working, there has to be a process where these women or whoever works go through a process of registering to make sure, number one, they are of age and they get educated on what to look for. I remember meeting a young lady, and when you work in this space and your eyes is open, you just see things, and you know how they say whatever your energy is coming to you. I remember being in LA educating law enforcement on this, and I went to a barbershop to get a haircut. And the woman that was giving me a haircut, and I'll just keep it open, it was a black barbershop, and I go in and I go, "You guys take walk-ins?" And they go, "Yeah." And they pointed to this white girl, had pink hair down at the very end. I was like, "Really, dude?" Like, nah, she's good. Matter of fact, she gave me one of the best haircuts I've ever had. But, you're sitting in the chair, you're having a conversation, and she goes, "Well, why are you in LA?" And I was telling her, "Yeah, I'm retired homeland. I'm here educating law enforcement on human trafficking." And as soon as I used the word, she stopped, right? And she goes, "I was caught up in that." I go, "Well, what do you mean?" She goes, "Yes, at home issues." Again, the nucleus. At home, had home issues, ran away, ended up at a strip club by herself, no education, nothing going on, ended up meeting her pimp in the strip club, right? So I bring that story up because that's a real life story of some women that are working in this legal business. If you don't have that relationship and be able to educate them, on this process, that's what happened to her. She ended up meeting her pimp in a strip club. But this is a feel-good story because when I met her, what happened, she had gone to work that night, didn't bring home enough money, and she ran away because she knew going back to that pimp was going to be very brutal. And what saved her was mom and dad kept the door open. They knew what she was doing, and they kept the door open. And when she came home, they go, "Well, what do you want to do?" She goes, "I want to cut hair. I want to work in that space, and I want to get my master's barber license so I can teach other women, give them other skills to do other than feeling like that's the road that they have to take." And I remember a couple times, this is when I was working for the Atlanta Hawks, and we would go to LA a couple times. I would always seek her out to get a haircut from her because she was very good. And the last time I saw her was a couple years ago, and she had got her master's barber license, and I believe she has her own shop now.
Oh, that's cool. I love
Yeah, but it's going back to what we were saying, why I believe it should be a national process where people have to register, because not only we get to make sure of their age, we also get to educate them on what to look for and what to do if they find themselves in that situation. So I know you work on that advocacy. I know you push to change laws. So yeah, I was going to say, what's some new laws that you're trying to push, or advocating for in this space?
I think Florida has done a really good job with the way they manage it. And I'll tell you why. So in Florida, the last law that they passed, which was just this last session, it requires all adult clubs in the state to conduct mandatory age verification and keep those records on file 3 years post work history. And if they're not doing it correctly, if they're not doing it at all, they face third-degree felony charges. It is a no-brainer in this industry to do appropriate age verification. And the reason I think that the state of Florida probably made it incumbent upon the clubs, and some local areas go further than that and require registration, such as Fort Myers requires a license. I know Palm Beach County required a license. And you do have some areas that require a license in addition to the mandatory age verification. These are good checks and balances.
Yes.
I don't like the word registry because it gives me a bad feeling. And the only reason, and I have to tell you why. So in Seattle, they did this. and the state or the city of Seattle mandated all dancers have to register, and they created the set registry. Well, they have some guy that likes to go to a lot of the clubs, a resident, said, I'm seeking a Freedom of Information Act request, and I want the names and addresses of all the dancers.
Got you.
And that became a real problem. And luckily the court, because there wasn't a demonstrable reason that he should have that, and the dancers were terrified for their safety at that point, because a lot of them, as you know, they use stage names. So that became a real point and reasonable point of contention. So that's where I look at that sort of registry. I like mandatory age verification. 22 states have it. A lot of states, and I'm noticing this, I saw a couple pop up today, anyone who has 25 or more employees has to use E-Verify. In some states, they're also requiring that of independent contractors as well. I don't know all the legal stuff behind that and how they're able to do that now, because I know years ago, when we were looking at C.O.A.S.T to become part of the Blue campaign, that was a requirement that you had to E-Verify, and we couldn't E-Verify independent contractors. All of this is starting to change, because you're getting, there's two states now that have actually, or two clubs that have actually unionized dancers. One is in Seattle just voted. They're in contract negotiations. There was a club there. And then there was and it's called the Star Garden Topless Dive Bar. And they unionized. And they unionized through they unionized through the National Labor Relations Board. Will it take off across the country? Probably not. What will likely happen is that you're going to see, it's like things are politicized. You're going to see probably those more, and I hate to, for lack of a description, we'll just say the more progressive states are probably you're going to see a lot more of that. And then in those right to work states, which, by the way, there is a piece of federal legislation that does away with the right to work in states, which I don't think it'll pass, but it has been introduced. So you're getting some pushback. I'm reading more about unionization and in a lot of sectors. So you're getting this push and pull between corporations and business and workers now. And it'll be interesting overall, not just with the strip club industry, to see where that goes, because I do think it will impact the strip club industry for better or for worse. I don't know. And a lot of people in the industry, so we have a lot of clubs that actually have used the employee model. And we just had a club in Birmingham, a judge ruled that those dancers are employees. So you're seeing a lot more clubs that are adopting this employee model. And the consensus in the adult club industry is it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
Yeah.
So now you go to the dancers and they hate the model. So in California, and I'm giving you a lot, I'm throwing a lot.
No, this is great. That's what we're here to learn.
In California, under a law called AB 5, they made almost everyone in the state of California became an employee overnight, not just adult club dancers, but everybody. And so if you played in a band on the weekends at a club, you had to be an employee. Well, this proved really cumbersome and really painful, especially for small mom and pop businesses. So they started doing these carve outs. And what I found particularly interesting was that home health aides got a carve out, so they could be independent contractors and not employees. Hotel maids or housekeepers got a carve out, so they could be considered independent contractors. Agricultural workers got a carve out, so they could be considered independent contractors. Dancers did not get a carve out, and they fled. They fled the state en masse, and they went into Vegas and Reno to dance there. And when I asked some of the dancers why, they said, we don't like the model. And I said, but you're making $15 an hour now, and you have health benefits, and you have workers' comp, And they said no, because we have rules now. They tell us what to wear, when to show up. And then the other thing I learned was that the private dance that a dancer performs now becomes the work product of the club, and they can take the whole thing.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, and the dancer can get a tip. So just to make this simple, if a private dance is $20 and that's what the club charges, the club can take that whole thing, and if the gentleman gives her $25, she can keep the $5. They can't touch that, but they can take the 20.
Oh, wow.
And that, yeah, so it's kind of one of those catch-22s. Be careful what you wish for. And the dancers who got ensconced in that model absolutely hated it. Minneapolis, it's a different story. I think all the dancers there are employees, and they've sort of gotten used to the model, or they don't know anything else because it's been like that for years. In California now, what we're seeing is the club owners are liking the model, because they said, we have all these new dancers that have come in who have never worked under anything else. So they don't, they like it. And now they can post rules, and they can, you have to wear a gown on the floor. You have to study current events or whatever. I don't know what rules they're imposing. Those are just some of the things I've heard. So good, bad, there's pros and cons. There's growing pains and everything, right?
Right.
So,
well, look, at the end of the day, again, there are people that are against this industry, period, but it's here. So if it's going to be here, why not make it a safe and beneficial to the women or men that have to go into this space? Make sure that they're protected. So as we get ready to wrap up, what's the next step? I know you were in Vegas recently, and I want you to know you can always count on me to go wherever you are, because I'm passionate about this. And you mentioned something, because a long time ago when we were doing this, where they rather you do it at an event instead of inside the club. You mentioned we did some events inside of clubs, and I've always, and I always talk to them like, guys, some of these people have been in this business for years, and they have created a family atmosphere. And I've always said to them, treat these girls as if they're your sister. Protect them. Just like any job you go to, you create relationships and you care about each other, friendships. And it's so important, especially in this world, because a lot of people on the dark side come there with alternative motives other than entertainment. They're seeking to victimize. They're seeking to do horrible things. And it's so important that we focus in that area. And I saw that. That's why I always leave them with that, hey, guys, you're family. Treat everybody in that space. So we'll close with anything. Now, two things. You were in Vegas. What was that about? And then what's the next step when you come into Miami? I know Fort Lauderdale kind of encumbered Miami, but look, like I said, I'll go wherever you want me to go to support what you're doing. So Vegas, what's the next step, and when you come to Miami?
Yeah, so as you know, January is anti-human trafficking month.
Right.
And we tend to coordinate a lot of our upcoming meetings. So I think for the year, as we move into the holidays, we tend to slow down with the coast meetings.
Right.
So any scheduled at this moment. Now that could change. And then boom, January, we start all over again. So it comes back, comes around full circle. So it's Tampa, it's Miami, it's hopefully Palm Beach again, because they did an outstanding job. And so hopefully we just kind of kicked off, and then I wind up, there's Houston, there's Dallas, there's San Antonio, there's Chicago, it's New York, it goes all over the place. But I'll keep you in mind.
Well, listen, Angelina, go ahead. I'm sorry.
You do an outstanding job. So happy to have you. And this is just us too, as an example of maintaining that contact and developing a friendship over years of working together, which has been, and I was so happy to reconnect with you. I'm just really proud of you. And I thank you too for, your service. And because I know, you had the National Guard experience prior to becoming a federal agent, and for you to keep picking up this torch with human trafficking, that's a sincerity too. That's a passion. That's being of service to others. And I thank you for that.
Thank you. And it ain't easy, but when you're living in your purpose and your passion, it's not a job. You're doing it because that's what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
Well, listen, my friend, I want to thank you again. I know you're busy. Last time you were here, I got to meet your lovely family. They're so supportive of you, and I thought they were so awesome. And thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with us and educate the audience on the behind scenes of what's happening in strip clubs, what C.O.A.S.T is doing, and how, what you're doing is from the experience that you've lived. And I want to say, coming from that, when you first walked out the door being released from the program, I'm wearing today this shirt. It's called Girl Power. And I just want to bring it out because it's an organization addressing those issues of what they call not at risk girls, but at promise girls. And they're the woman that's running the program, Dima Campbell. She's been at this for 20 years, and I remember as an agent working with them, going by to speak to these young ladies, and they have developed into a wonderful organization where the city of Miami has given them property to build a $20 million home for at promise girls and women who age out of programs. They're $10 million in of a $20 million project. I support them. And because as you know, working in this space is all about partnerships and people working together. And you're covering a sector that nobody really knows about, talks about. But fortunately, they have someone like you to care about the women in that space and that they're not by themselves. So thank you, my friend, for what you do. And
I got to say, the clubs do a good job. It's just what you said at the beginning of our talk, that it's the clubs that aren't in the room that need to be there.
Right.
And in the clubs that are in the room, they do a good job.
Last thing, is there some type of, I'm hoping for a registry, like I have friends that work in the model agencies and, all that. And I was like, hey guys, is there an agency that's regulating this business? Because, people send out models, come be a model, come. And these young women that has those aspirations to be a model, is there a spot that they can go to and go, hey, is this a legitimate club or is it a bad club? Are you thinking about creating some type of registry that people can come to C.O.A.S.T and say, hey, which clubs are good and which clubs are bad? In the sense that
that word registry.
I know. I got to get rid of that word. But some type of,
There's actually, so what I like is there is a third party, not owned by anybody in the strip club industry. It's an app, and it's called Pole Position. And it really allows the dancers control. And it's owned in part by a woman and also a woman who is a coder. She's a software coder. She never danced. She was never a dancer. She actually worked in the medical industry doing software in the medical industry. And she joined forces with an attorney who is an employment law attorney, and he used to sue the clubs. So he used to sue the clubs under the Fair Labor Standard Act violations. But they built this very promising app that they keep improving based on feedback from the dancers. And it allows the dancer to pick and choose where she wants to work. It gives her autonomy. And then, they say, oh, this club, that club, but the owners can go on there or management can go on there too, but they don't have the ability to directly, the manager can basically say, hey, we've got Super Bowl coming up. I'm looking for, if somebody wants to come work, flexible schedule, whatever. But there's somehow it's back into where there's no way, like they can't disparage one another,
Right.
and the dance ultimately has the total control.
They get to
So
say their experiences with the clubs and what's good. That's awesome.
yeah, and I go through it. So in fact, I was so impressed. You met my daughter
Yes.
in Palm Beach. She has an economics degree and a minor in computer science, and she graduated from Rollins, but she was working for a wealth management company, and they just took her on at pole position because it spoke to her, that sense of autonomy that the dancers, and she said, Mom, I really want to look at overseeing this at some point. And she's learned everything she can about that app so that they can make it better. So
That's
they
awesome.
educate the right. And we've even talked about putting, and we don't know how we'll do it yet. And maybe this is where you could come into play, Victor, about maybe doing some little video clips on anti-human trafficking. We haven't gone that far because I think it's really important to get people in the room. But for those people we can't get in the room or who won't get up and come to a C.O.A.S.T meeting, maybe we could, maybe that is a viable solution for the dancers that don't come in person to the C.O.A.S.T meetings for whatever reason.
Right.
So it's something to look into, and maybe you could have that. And in fact, I can connect you with my daughter, and the two of you could have that conversation.
Well, she's a lovely lady. I'll support her just like I'll support you. And if there's anything that we can do to make that, because I think it's important that we have, dancers do have a voice to say about their experiences. And for those clubs that are doing things right and the ones that are doing things wrong and putting themselves in danger, I think this would be great. But like every time I meet you, it's always good energy. I'm always learning something. And, I can't wait. Like I said, I'll support you to the end because I always believe in what you're doing. And our relationship is amazing. And thank you for being a friend. Thank you for coming on the show. Give my best to the family. And let's have those talks whenever you guys are ready.
Yeah, and I'm coming over at some point. I'll give you a heads up, and if you allow me the honor of taking you to lunch, I'd love to do so.
Anytime in your presence is a pleasure of mine. Thank you, my friend. Take care.
Thank you.
All righty. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Welcome to another show of Reinforcement with Vic Williams.